wedding between these two clan leaders at the point of the U.S. military might. What's to say that once we leave, this agreement just doesn't dissolve?
Well, there are a couple assumptions there. First of all, we will continue to be hopeful, and certainly I don't want any of my comments to put any pressure on that agreement. I think it was very positive work that was done today, and we will just remain hopeful that it is there. But you also, in phase 2 and phase 3 of the program, coalition peacekeeping forces are in there right after us, so this transition will go on for a period of time, and we'll have a good period of time in that process to observe this agreement, and also, frankly, to see how many of the points on that original agreement are actually met.
Well, you mentioned that this Kismayo situation was not unprecedented and that hostages had been taken before. Can you provide some context? Can you tell us when this happened last? Has it happened previously in Kismayo? And how were those incidents resolved?
Okay, well, for example, we had an incident with one faction that took another relief worker in Mogadishu just a day or two before we arrived, and that individual was held for a few days and was released yesterday. We had a situation like this in Baidoa, where for a couple of days recently, not within the last couple of days, but maybe 3 or 4 days ago, where relief workers were held for a brief period of time. And then when the food and the money to the appropriate level was provided, the hostages, if we want to describe them that way, were released without harm. So that seems to be it.
Kismayo previously?
I don't have personal knowledge of an example of it happening recently. What I was trying to do with this example is kind of prepare us mentally that these things are going to happen. Hopefully they'll all turn out as favorably as those in the past have, but it's not an isolated, one-off, never-before-happened tactic. And most importantly of all, those relief agencies, which have tremendous commitment to this situation, are very knowledgeable of this. They know it. They know it happens in Somalia, and they're prepared for those consequences.
The demands are such that this is in character with those earlier instances?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
In Baidoa, do you have a more recent, the chart says as of the night of December 10th it was calm, and in Somalia that's about 24 hours ago. Do you have any more current assessment of the situation there? And also...
You can extrapolate the bottom of that graphic onto today. We don't have, I have not had major reports, say in the last 10 or 12 hours, of significant security problems in Baidoa. That doesn't mean A, they haven't happened, but B, I just don't have anything to confirm it.
And not necessarily escorting a convoy, but when is it expected there'll be some Marine presence in Baidoa to at least get some
I
security?
think General Brantner has alluded to that question several times.
Is there anything to the report that some weapons have been abandoned in Baidoa in advance in the expectation that U.S. forces will soon be arriving?
No.
Last question. What will be the concept of operations at Baidoa? What will the Army do there? Will it be a base camp? What will happen there?
As we've discussed previously, when the Army forces arrive, after the Marines have secured it, they will establish their airhead and begin the throughput for the remaining forces to come in. As they gather their combat strength and their abilities on the ground with their combat service support elements and the aviation element, they will expand their security zone out to some outlying areas that they will use for subsequent distribution points. And this will take place in what we, as the chairman briefed you on, was phase 2 of the operation, which we discussed in the first days. And so their plans are to expand from that airhead and use that as their base of operations. Thank you very much.
Just housekeeping.
And that concludes the briefing at the Pentagon for today, and a quick update on the situation in Somalia. The bottom line being that the officials at the Pentagon today don't want to speculate, get involved in any way in setting expectations for a timetable for the Marines and the ground forces to move outward from Mogadishu, primarily because it is both logistically and politically, not to mention militarily, an uncertain situation, and the officials at the Pentagon saying the ultimate decisions on that situation must be made on the ground by the commander in Somalia. Additionally, word that there is a hostage situation in the city of Kismayo to the south. According to Rear Admiral Kramer, a small number of presumably Western relief workers are being held there. Apparently no Americans being held, but he takes great pains to point out that this sort of thing has happened before, most recently in Mogadishu just within the past several days. Apparently, after some bribes were paid and some arms twisted, those relief workers were released, and the Rear Admiral expresses some optimism that the situation will resolve itself in a peaceful way again this time. We'll be back with our military analyst, James Blackwell, right after this.
Up and fight with each other, and certainly that is consistent with the characterization of today's briefing, that is, that there are isolated incidents that they are continuing to deal with. I thought it was interesting to note that General Brantner was careful not to second-guess the handling of these incidents on the ground, in particular the one day before yesterday with the French troops, while there were some pretty piercing questions about was it really an armed threat to the checkpoint. Brantner wouldn't bite off on that. He deferred to the commander on the ground.
It raises an interesting question because the Somali charge at the UN mission yesterday said that if, you know, that this mission was meant to save lives, not cost lives, especially civilian lives. What is to happen in a situation like this where we're going to have troops from all different nationalities, which may have overall the same rules of engagement, but they may be interpreted differently by different groups? The general steered very clear of any kind of criticism of the French, I noticed.
He certainly did. And it's not clear how any sort of investigation or follow-up is going to be conducted of this incident. If it were a purely American operation, there would be a command investigation of some sort, and I'm sure that the French would have some provisions for that as well. But apparently this is a United Nations command function. That is, General Johnston is being referred to as the overall commander. The French forces were reported yesterday as being under his command. So that's one of those details they're going to have to work out and satisfy to the extent that they're going to conduct these kinds of follow-up checks.
Jim, what do you make of the persistent questioning on the subject of, you know, bottom line, when are you going to get to Baidoa?
Yeah.
When are you going to get to some of these other places? The persistent response, which was, I'm not going to second-guess the commander on the ground. We'll get there when we get there. Are things moving more slowly than anticipated?
I think they're moving at about the pace that they had anticipated. Now, there are so many
control of all fighters and armed vehicles to be assembled in camps outside the city, and a call to all Somalis to join in reconciliation for peace and unity. If it holds, this agreement will clear out thousands of gunmen from Mogadishu and other areas, making it much easier for U.S. troops to protect deliveries of food and other relief supplies. And it could be a real beginning of a political settlement.
I would love to see a Somalia that have again a government.
My baby will be luckier than me because life will be better here now.
But Somalis know each other too well to believe the smiles and handshakes have solved Somalia's political crisis. Clan rivalries are deep, and there are many other armed factions controlled by others not represented at this meeting. By bringing these two leaders face to face at last, U.S. diplomacy and military power have given Somalis not only hope of ending starvation, but also hope for a peace agreement that could bring Somalia together again. Gary Stryker, CNN, Mogadishu.
And the U.S. military presence is growing here by the day. Today, 700 more Marines arrived. They came from their base in California, and they've come here to back up the 1,700 Marines who spearheaded Operation Restore Hope. They landed at Mogadishu Airport aboard two 747 chartered jets. Most of them are technical and support staff, people desperately needed to set up a whole infrastructure for the rest of the troops, who will eventually number about 30,000. It's a massive logistical operation. Nothing here works, and everything from water to fuel and food must be brought in. Now, although Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney says he hopes the troops may start being pulled out in about 3 months, many of the new arrivals we spoke to said they're prepared to stay for the long haul, perhaps as many as 8 months. Now, the Marines who've been patrolling the streets and manning checkpoints have been confiscating weapons, but Marine Colonel Fred Peck said and announced today that the Marines won't be acting and won't be declaring an all-out war on the locals with arms.
The United States policy here is that if we see weapons openly displayed in an area over which we exercise control, we will consider the person with the weapon to be hostile to us until we can determine otherwise, and we will disarm that person or those persons, particularly any crew-served weapon and a crew served weapon is something like a machine gun, a rocket launcher, or a mortar. Any crew served weapon we see, we will consider a threat, and we will take actions to confiscate it, and in other words, take it away from the people who have it. We will not be searching houses, randomly searching cars, stopping every time we see a vehicle. If we did, we would accomplish nothing else in Somalia except going around Mogadishu policing up weapons. We realize that the people here in Somalia, having been victims of violence for now a good 2 years in civil war, often have weapons for self-defense. Almost all of Somali homes probably have a weapon for self-defense. If we went into any home, and probably most automobiles, and looked for weapons, we might find one. What we're saying is, we see a weapon, we will consider you hostile, we'll take your weapon away from you, and we won't give it back.
And certainly just the Marine presence on the streets here has been enough to restore a lot of calm and a lot of peace to the streets of Mogadishu. That's it for now. I'm Christiana Wanpour, CNN reporting live from Mogadishu.
Good night, Christiane, and take care. In Washington, I'm Frank Sesno. Thanks for watching.
There's no government, still have a representative at the UN. Well, for one thing, the representative has to be willing to work for free. And you don't get paid.
No.
Fatun Hassan is the last remaining diplomat at a mission that is more or less penniless. She and a volunteer secretary do all of the work.
Good afternoon, Somali mission.
Hassan's mission is to keep the Somali mission going until a government is reestablished back home. She says she represents no clan, no faction.
I'm only representing the Somali people.
Hassan ended up in charge after the Somali ambassador left, following the coup that threw Somalia into anarchy. Bank accounts were frozen, paychecks stopped. One by one, mission staff and diplomats departed. Hassan stayed because her husband is able to support them both. Forget fancy limos and drivers. Hassan drives herself in a Plymouth Horizon. She has had to plead for money from other missions, for instance, Kuwait. The Kuwaitis, with their chandeliers, give their fellow Muslims, the Somalis, a couple of $1,000s a month to pay the utility bills.
We think that this country does exist and should exist, and we will help it to exist.
The Somalis own their mission, but they say they owe the building the mission is in some $60,000 for maintenance. Which explains why building management changed the locks and no longer allows the Somalis access to the restroom on their floor. But Hassan has bigger worries. She attends UN meetings, drafts letters, and issues an occasional press release, but can't really make policy.
Sometimes it's really so frustrating when you know that there's no government. You don't have any one to turn to.
Asked about the pictures she sees on TV of starving Somalis, Hassan says, "We never thought such a thing could happen to us." She says she's grateful for the help Somalia is getting and describes what it was like when the Security Council voted to authorize force.
Oh, really, I was emotional, and I was just thinking how my people were feeling back at home.
She is trying to make the permanent mission of Somalia more permanent than the chaos at home.
700 Marines arrived in Mogadishu yesterday and more are on the way. The reinforcements and a surprise truce between two major warlords had relief officials optimistic, but continuing violence in the capital is slowing relief efforts. U.S. Marines have reportedly escorted a 20-ton relief convoy into northern Mogadishu today, but aid officials had hoped to move more than twice that amount. And U.S. Marines postponed another relief convoy destined for Baidoa for at least a week. That area has been decimated by factional violence, and aid workers there are pleading for U.S. military intervention. More of the same in Kismayu, where relief workers are pulling out due to increased violence. The Pentagon says some aid workers have been taken hostage, but relief agencies are denying that report. The UN is trying to keep the
war is not bringing peace to the East African nation, even in the capital. An Associated Press photographer was robbed by armed teenagers in Mogadishu today. The same photographer was later stoned along with two other photographers while they were waiting to take pictures of the first Marine-escorted convoy into northern Mogadishu. That convoy had been delayed earlier today because of fighting between Somali factions. And battles outside the capital are preventing shipments from reaching parts of the countryside. A relief shipment to Baidoa has been postponed. Local relief organizations deny reports Several relief workers have been taken hostage in the southern city of Kismayu, and the Pentagon now says reports of hostage-taking there are unsubstantiated. The U.S. Air Force hopes to use a former Soviet air base at Escalating to transport food. A team of engineers and security troops has already secured it. UN Secretary General Butch.
Over? Not quite. Here's more from Steve Bush.
This country is suffering is going to take some time to achieve the primary objective. That's getting food out to the starving people. Limited facilities and too few runways to handle all the troop movements and equipment movements are slowing things down. And above all, the country is plagued by security problems. Day 4 of Operation Restore Hope, and US forces confirm that their helicopters have again been hit by ground fire. Gunships swooping low over Mogadishu have become part of the landscape, but not everyone's pleased they're here. A returning crew reported that they were fired on while hovering about 150 feet over some houses. The machine gunner said he did not return fire because there were too many people in the area. This aircraft was hit twice by automatic fire. The first round glanced off the rotor blade. A second went clean through, but the crew had no problems landing. The incident highlights the difficulties US forces have in dealing with a civilian population which is armed and prepared to use their weapons for whatever reason. Both the UN Secretary General and the French government are pressing for the multinational forces to help disarm Somalia. Washington wants to stick to the humanitarian objectives without getting embroiled in any program of disarmament. Yesterday, the two main warlords in Mogadishu agreed on terms for a new peace accord. It looked friendly enough, but these two men do not control the entire country. So their appeal for a total cessation of hostilities and the call for all freelance gunmen to report to collection areas within the next 24 hours may fall on deaf ears. Meanwhile, it could take a week before the multinational forces are ready to attempt clamping down on security outside Mogadishu. No emergency food has reached any of the hunger zones since the military operation began. But the hope is that once the bulk of reinforcements are in the country, armed humanitarian relief can stop the food disaster. Over at the port, relief organisations are expecting to bring in more food shortly. More ships carrying wheat are on the way. And they've been encouraged by the fact that this morning, the first convoy of food eventually got out of the port. The first day it tried to leave, monsoon rains prevented it. And yesterday, the meeting of warlords to thrash out that peace accord, the security problems surrounding that meeting also delayed the convoy. However, the food has only moved from the southern end of the city, which is controlled by General Mohammed Farah Aidid, to the northern end of the city. It has not gone out to any of the main hunger areas. For example, outside Baidoa, 150 miles west of Mogadishu, security is still said to be bad there. I'm Brent Sadler, CNN, reporting live from Mogadishu.
Brent, certainly among the incredible pictures this week was what we just saw there, the embrace of those two warlords. After all the bitterness and aggravation between those two, is there a feeling that they really mean it and that it's going to make a difference there?
Well, I think the first point to make is the fact that the two warlords only came back and embraced and shook hands after they were asked to do so by the waiting media outside. I think you have to go back to the history of what's been going on in Somalia, which is the fact that those two men helped in the resistance movement to overthrow the dictator Mohammed Siad Barre. He was kicked out of this country in January 1991. After that, the freedom fighters, as they like to call themselves, squabbled over who would take what parts of the city, and they've been back.
Öppnade två arméhelikoptrar eld mot fordon med beväpnade somalier. Flera personer dödades, men det är ännu oklart hur många som dödades. Samtidigt lyckades amerikanska soldater idag föra ut livsmedel till delar av staden som hållits av beväpnade banditgäng tidigare.
Det var ännu en dag med tryckande hetta, men med ett nytt inslag här i Mogadishu. Amerikanska trupper på väg över fronten, gröna linjen. Tusentals människor mötte oss när vi, trupperna och mediacirkusen, rullade in i för oss tidigare okända områden. Det här är interimspresidenten Ali Mahdis anhängare, men hjälpen har haft svårt att nå fram på grund av banditgängen i gröna linjen. Men idag fanns det ingen fientlighet.
Säkerhetsproblemen har varit och är fortfarande enorma. Men nu har den första konvojen med militär eskort kommit fram dit till norra Mogadishu.
Det var förväntansfulla människor som fick se 20 ton med ris, ärtor och bönor och olja lastas ur lastbilarna. Tråden var sedan tidigare halvfulla. För om dagens konvoj var ett första prov på hur det ska skötas i fortsättningen så handlar det för människorna här om säkerhet. Men var dagens militära pådrag verkligen nödvändigt?
We have been running convoys here all the time, but there's almost always been trouble until recently. And this is one of the reasons we wanted to have protection, was to have convoys here that we didn't have a fear of looting, we didn't have a fear of violence, and the people at the other end would...
It says it carried only a fraction of what care normally moves. In other parts of the capital, U.S. helicopters came under attack twice today. In one incident, the choppers returned fire. Brent Sadler has details.
It was on a routine reconnaissance patrol that 2 U.S. Cobra helicopter gunships were fired on from the ground. In a brief exchange of fire, 3 Somali battle wagons were destroyed by wire-guided tow missiles. It was the first combat and exchange of fire between international forces and an armed militia.
About 2 miles north of the U.S. Embassy, a pair of AH-1 Cobras were on a routine reconnaissance mission, and they were fired upon by an M113 armored personnel carrier with a 50 caliber machine gun. They immediately returned fire with tow anti-tank missiles and 20 millimeter cannons, and they destroyed that vehicle and 2 vehicles that accompanied it. There were, the other 2 vehicles were one carrying a recoilless rifle, I don't know what caliber, and the other one was carrying a machine gun of unknown caliber. We don't have any estimate of casualties on the ground, but we do know that all 3 vehicles were destroyed.
This was the latest incident involving U.S. helicopters taking ground fire. Earlier, another gunship was hit twice by rifle shots over the city center. Bullets hit the rotor blade, but the pilots managed to land safely. The crew from that mission said they were unable to return fire because of the high number of unarmed Somali civilians in the area. The U.S. military spokesman said the incident happened in an area of the city where there have been sporadic gun battles between rival clans throughout most of the day. He said he hoped the incident would dissuade other Somalis from firing on U.S. helicopters and added that airborne reconnaissance operations would continue. Brent Sadler, CNN, Mogadishu.
Sarajevo Airport has...
Somali casualties, none on the U.S. side. CNN's Brent Sadler reports.
Ever since U.S. forces landed in Mogadishu, helicopter gunships have been flying low-level reconnaissance. Today was no exception. It was on one of their routine missions that 2 AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters from the USS Tripoli were shot at from inside the city by an unknown group of well-armed gunmen.
They were fired upon by an M113 armored personnel carrier with a 50 caliber machine gun. They immediately returned fire with tow anti-tank missiles and 20 millimeter cannons, and they destroyed that vehicle and 2 vehicles that accompanied it.
It's not known how many Somalis were killed, because when tow missiles hit their targets, nothing is left. US officials say that uncontrolled gunmen have been shooting at helicopters and that the Cobra retaliation meant that they'd learned the hard way.
Detectables should be off the roads, and above all, there should be no threats and no shooting at U.S. forces. In this case, the shot, they clearly intended to bring down the helicopter if they could. The helicopter replied in a very strong way, which fits American doctrine of use overwhelming force if you get into a fight, and it's also the safe way to do it, and we hope that the lesson is conveyed.
Earlier, another US reconnaissance aircraft flying at less than 150 feet was hit by rifle fire. The gunner said he did not shoot back because there were too many unarmed civilians in the area. This gunship was hit twice. One bullet glanced a section of the rotor, and a second round penetrated the other half of the blade, but the pilot managed to land safely. Somali radio reported that the attacks on helicopters was the work of uncontrollables trying to wreck a new peace accord. Low-level missions over the city will continue. Ironically, the first exchange of fire between the multinational forces and an armed Somali group happened as a shipment of food left the seaport. No emergency aid had left the warehouses since the arrival of US troops. 20 tons of food was escorted out by a contingent of well-armed Marines with light armored vehicles. It was going to the northern end of the city. But more importantly, no food has got beyond Mogadishu since Operation Restore Hope began. So far, around 3,000 US troops have arrived in Somalia and almost 700 tons of equipment. But the full flow of troop reinforcements has yet to begin. Meanwhile, more food is on the way to be offloaded at the now well-secured port, where more logistical supplies are being put ashore. Bringing in large amounts of emergency food aid into the city's vital port here may no longer be a problem. Getting it out to the people who desperately need it, though, most certainly is. Brent Sadler, CNN, Mogadishu.
CNN's Christian Amanpour joins us live now from Mogadishu. Christian, what's going on now?
Well, David, the situation here is that people are really wondering how long it's going to take to get these U.S. troops out to places like Baidoa, as you heard in that report. And we're hearing that it's going to be at least a week, if not longer. Security is the primary consideration here, and the primary consideration is not to put U.S. troops' lives at risk. Although the relief officials in Baidoa are saying the situation is so desperate and they're calling on the U.S. troops to come right now. Apparently, we're going to be waiting for some more army troops to come and secure an area halfway between the capital here, Mogadishu, and Baidoa. And only after that is in place and up and running will the troops then go into Baidoa, David.
And today, Christian, concurrent with that action that was just reported on by Brent Sadler, we had the first movement of food on the ground in Mogadishu. What do you know of future movements of food?
Well, we're told and we're expecting tomorrow a big shipment of wheat to come in to pull into the port. It's carrying about 3,000 tons of wheat, and the port is now secure, and it's important because it's the first shipment that will have come to dock here since October, and certainly the first shipment to try to have come here since last month, when the last vessel that tried to come in was shelled offshore and had to turn back.
And Ambassador Oakley, he referred to those technicals who were shooting at the helicopter at the Cobras as rogue elements. And yet those kind of elements are probably still moving more freely further out away from Mogadishu. He must expect more problems.
Well, that's what makes the situation so unsure and so uncertain, because although the rival warlords have said that they will cooperate and that they will gather their men and their arms and keep them from firing, there are these people who are not under their direct control. And today we saw, we went to a warehouse where one of the rival warlords has ordered his so-called technicals to come and be stacked up. So you can see that going on. But there is a lot of uncontrollable unknowns out there.
Christian Amanpour in Mogadishu. Thank you. Andrea.
Well, David, as Christian just mentioned, relief workers in Somalia are urging quick action and protection by U.S. forces. CNN's Anthony Collins is standing by at the Pentagon with more on that. Anthony?
Well, Andrea, the Defense Secretary Dick Cheney is well aware of complaints from relief workers outside Mogadishu that they still are not getting protection by U.S. troops, but he indicates they're going to have to wait.
Relief workers in the Somalian city of Baidoa are worried about delays in sending in U.S. Marines to protect them from gun-toting looters. Baidoa is a hard-hit famine area to the northwest of the capital, Mogadishu. One relief agency, World Vision International, said it bordered on criminal neglect for U.S. troops to be 150 miles away and not even send 50 Marines to ward off violence. This after a refugee was killed during the night trying to keep looters out of a feeding center. One relief worker said if Marines did not get there soon, there would be no relief workers left to protect. On CNN's Evans and Novak program, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney responded to the complaint that Marines are too slow to arrive.
Eventually we will get to Baidoa. We would like to get there as quickly as possible, but the commander on the scene has to make the decisions about the pace of the operation, and one of his considerations will be to make certain that we do it carefully, cautiously, and deliberately to minimize the cost both in terms of American and potentially Somali.
The commander of Operation Restore Hope, Marine Lieutenant General Robert Johnston, says he's delaying sending troops into the interior until later next week at the earliest. He says the security of our troops is always paramount. Analysts noted that it took from Wednesday's Marine landing until Saturday for the Marines to guard the first, largely symbolic shipment of food across town in Mogadishu.
Pentagon officials confirmed that U.S. forces will not go into Baidoa until after U.S. Army troops arrive from the United States at an airfield about halfway between Mogadishu and Baidoa. They say that should happen within the next few days. Anthony Collins, CNN Live at the Pentagon.
Thank you, Anthony. A watershed day.
The first encounter for more than a year between Somalia's two most powerful faction leaders and an agreement for a ceasefire. And yet, it doesn't look as if the gun-toting thugs who support them will be cowed by the might of the French Foreign Legion and the US Marines who moved in on Wednesday.
It was about 5:30 when the main batch of US Marines were brought into Mogadishu Airport and Harbour. Operation Restore Hope, the first time the UN has authorized military intervention for solely humanitarian purposes, is underway. And then comes the job of winning hearts and minds. It wasn't a good start. On the ground are men whose job it has been to guard the hangars. They were apparently unarmed, but treated in what can only be described a humiliating manner. It took the intervention of UN Commander Imtiaz Shaheen, till now unpopular with many in Mogadishu, to have the men released. It wasn't the only episode that didn't go to plan. Ahead of the main landing, a crack team of US Navy SEALs trained to work behind the lines had come ashore to find nothing more hostile than the glare of press cameras. There were even suggestions that the whole operation might have been timed to fit in with prime-time American TV broadcasts. The movement of men and materiel has gone on without a stop. It'll be like this for a few more days as the Marines establish a logistics base. Eventually, about 30,000 troops could be involved. Certainly, after the strong-arm tactics, the atmosphere is now much more relaxed. Hundreds flocked to the airport, where for a while at least they were allowed to move about freely. The Americans are keen to establish contact, to show they have no hidden agenda. Even those aid agencies who feared the military option now seem to accept the Marines will make a difference. In Baidoa, the heart of the famine zone, about 90 people are still dying each day, a figure that's crept up recently. Even so, many of the agencies have pulled out their aid workers because of an increase in lawlessness. It's not the UN, but America that's made the running and bringing Mogadishu's rival warlords together. If the reconciliation lasts, it'll do more than all the food aid put together.
And U.S. Marines have just secured an airstrip in Baldi Dogli as they inch closer to the famine-ridden city of Baidoa. CNN's Brent Sadler joins us now from Somalia's capital with the latest on the progress of the humanitarian mission. Brent?
Well, Ralph, that first airstrip to be secured by US Marines has indeed received its first flight. There was no opposition to the takeover of the strip at Baladogle, about 50 miles outside Mogadishu. The first aircraft into the strip was a British RAF C-130 Hercules transporter loaded with a cargo of rice donated by the French government. The rice was given to local militiamen in exchange for their weapons. 200 Marines have begun setting up camp. It's unlikely that any move into Baidoa will begin until more reinforcements arrive. Tens of thousands of tons of food is on its way to Somalia.